started. It's a new parak today. Daf Nun Dalin. So James, a whole new world for us to explore, but really a continuation of what we've been discussing. And the basic concept, basic idea is that people are making Nedarim, they're prohibiting foods on themselves. And we're trying to understand what exactly they mean, either with language. So last parak we dealt a lot with language. What does a word mean? And obviously if you have if you have a complex food, right, you make a stew out of rice, let's say, and you prohibit rice, what happens with the stew, and vice versa. Today we go a little bit more fundamental. So Daf Nun Dalin, the beginning of the parak, says the Mishnah, Hanoder min hayerek. A person says they're not going to eat yirakot. Now, we of course usually translate yirakot as vegetables. I'm sure there's a botanical, I guess, definition of vegetable. That's not really what the Mishnah, of course, is considering. It's common usage. And there's two understandings here about what yerek means. One is that it's as opposed to fruit, that a yerek is something that grows, I guess, I'm gonna probably sound very ignorant here, but it grows, I guess, straight from the bush itself or the ground itself, but it doesn't have a stem, so to speak. So now, I'm not sure if that's the real definition, but something to that extent. The Ran here understands a yerek as opposed to a pri. The opposite of a yerek, or the other side of a yerek, is something that's a fruit. So that's one interpretation. So if you're noder min hayerek, you're mutar bideluim. Things like pumpkins, right, that are gourds, are considered to be fruits as opposed to yirakot. Again, not in the terms
and they actually are a form of fruit.
Well, so again, there's a lot of questions, right? There's also questions, of course, of brachot, where you say pri adama, pri hates.
But tomatoes, eggplants, are all fruits, but we treat them as vegetables.
Right. So again, I don't exactly know, where we draw the line, but says our Mishnah, you would be mutar bideluim. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva disagrees, and we actually pasnik Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva says that diluim are included in a person's neder about yirakot. Again, not a comment on how they grow, right, but on what you mean. The Rush, actually, the Ran quotes the Ran quotes the Rush here, not in his name, has a different interpretation. He says that yirakot refers to things that you eat raw, like crudité kind of thing. And that anything that you have to cook is not, so again, it doesn't have to do with really how it grows. It has to do with, the way it's eaten, whether it's edible, kimot shehu, the way it is. And so a pumpkin is excluded because obviously no human eats a pumpkin without cooking it. So that's the definition. Again, so either one, you get some sense of what you're talking about. But that's the machloket in the Mishnah. Now, Amrullah the Rabbi Akiva, the Chachamim, or the Tanakama, said to Rabbi Akiva, why would you say that a dalat, a pumpkin, is the same as a yerek? Hello, Amar Adam l'shlucho, kach yerek. You send your associate out to the shuk, right, to buy yirakot for you. And who Omer, he's going to come back and say, Lo matzati ela diluim. I didn't find any carrots. I didn't find any yirakot. I only found diluim. So you see that it's not something. My kids and I were joking. This is the Instacart thing. You order remote, groceries. So they always ask, can they substitute, right? So this would be a substitute, right? They wouldn't buy it for you. They would ask you if this is what you want. Says Rabbi Akiva, I'm looking at davar. That's exactly the point, right? The fact is that they're going to come to you and ask you, do you want this instead? So clearly they're connected. They're not going to come and ask you, do you want to buy beans, right? You ask for yirakot. So where am I? Amalam kena davar. Oshema amar hu lo matzati al kitniot is the messenger going to come back and say, I didn't find any of your yirakot. I found hot dogs, right? Obviously, that's a different thing. But they will ask you, and they say, I found diluim. So diluim are bichlal yerek, and kitniot and eno bichlal yerek. So they're similar enough, though it's true they're not identical to yirakot, but they're within the subfamily. And so if you sent someone out to get yirakot, they would come back and say, we didn't find yirakot, but we found diluim, and therefore it's included in the neder when you say you don't want to eat it. And continues the Mishnah, there's one other halacha, which is similar, is that you'd be asur bepul ha-mitzri lach. You're talking about pul, right? Beans, whatever kind of beans they are. Fava beans, we often say, right? But whatever beans, that if they're moist, meaning they're still growing on the tree, they're in the pod, then they're essentially a yerek, right? And that fits a lot with the rush because you would eat them raw. But once they're dried, of course, once they're mature and they sat on the bush for a long time, then obviously you're not going to eat them until you soak them and cook them for quite some time. So therefore, you'd be mutar biyavish. You'd be allowed to eat them. They're not considered in the family of yirakot anymore once they're dried out beans. Continues the Mishnah. The Gemara, sorry. Hanoder min hayerek. So Rabbi Akiva said that because the person will go and the shopping and will say, oh, what about dalat? You're not allowed to eat a dalat either. Says Gemara, but it doesn't, even if the person's going to ask you, hamin yerek nadar, right? You definitely said, I don't want to have yerek. It doesn't fit the definition, even if it's within a subfamily. Amar Ula, Omer Yarkei Kedera Alai. No, the question here is, you didn't actually say Yarek, because if you just said Yarek, it would just mean that. But you said Yarkei Kedera, a Yarek that goes into a pot, which sounds to me more general than not only a regular Yarek, but even one that you will cook, right? Which is, of course, a pumpkin. So that's what you must have said. Doesn't remember, that's still not clear that it means a pumpkin. Dilma yerek hanechal b'ketera kamar. You said I don't want to eat a yerek, the type of yerek that you cook, but still a pumpkin's not called a yerek. So says sorry, where am I? But Omer, it has to be where you said yerek hamitbashel b'ketera alai, right? That the question is where a person said a yerek that is cooked, not that is eaten with things that are cooked, but it itself is cooked. And now the question is, you said yerek, which implies certain foods that are either eaten raw or are not a fruit, right? But you then said hamit bashal b'kteira to include things that are cooked and prepared in a pot. Are you including things like pumpkins in your statement? Says the Gemara b'Maikim Miflagi. So what is the machloket of the Tanakama, the Rabbanan, and Rabbi Akiva? That Rabbanan Savri, the Tanakama holds that kol milta de tzarech shlicha lamluchiala lav minehu. If the messenger needs to come back and say to you, you told me to buy this, I didn't have it, but they had something else similar, that's not the same min. Because the fact that they feel necessary to ask means that it's not taken for granted that it's a substitute, right? If you send someone out to get apples, I guess if they didn't have Granny Smith apples, they'd probably buy Red Delicious apples. But they wouldn't buy pears just because you said buy apples and they have no apples. They might come back and say to you, we didn't find any apples, but we found, pears. But they're not going to come back to you and say, we didn't find any apples, we found, milk, right? Obviously, that's not the same min. So that's what the Chachamim say. And Rabbi Akiva holds, kol milta de mimlich shlicha ala minehu. In fact, if the shliach would come back and say, I didn't find what you wanted, but I found something else, quote unquote, similar, that's considered to be the same min, and that's why the shliach, in fact, asked you about it. So that's the machloket in our Mishnah. However, says Abaya.
So there you have Chazal having Ruach HaKodesh. They knew that Instacart and food delivery services would be created in the 21st century and knew they had to address it.
Exactly. That's exactly what they did. You'll see in a second how it was very practical. Says Rabbi Abaya, just before you get too excited, it's Rabbi Akiva says you're not allowed to eat it, but he's not 100% confident about that. It seems to be like a stringency, right? Because he's concerned about a pumpkin would be considered a yerek. But Moder Rabbi Akiva, says Rabbi Abaya, Moder Rabbi Akiva, Lenin Malkot Shena Lokat. In fact, you're not going to get makot for this, right? If you make a vow and you violate your vow, you get makot, right? It's a Torah Bal Yachel Devaro. However, for this is, if you say I vow not to eat yerakot, but you eat a pumpkin, it's prohibited according to Rabbi Akiva, but it's not prohibited, midoraita, or at least unequivocally, and you don't get makot. So it's concerning, but don't take it all the way. Now it's not hata. Now we have a very fascinating and implication of this idea in the Mishnah in Me'ilah. If you recall, Me'ilah is an exception to the general rule of ein shliach l'dvar avera. Right? Usually, if I go to someone and say, can you do me a favor and go kill that guy, right? And he murders him, I'm not chayav for killing someone, right? Maybe in American law, I'd be chayav a lot of other things, but in the Torah, you're certainly not chayav for killing. The person went and killed someone else or violated Shabbat or whatever they did. The fact that they did it for me on my behalf, even if I paid them or whatever, I'm not chayav. There's a concept, ein shliach l'dvar avera, that it's something prohibited. They did it on their own volition. However, there are exceptions. And remember that you can make a shliach to take truma for you, which is a mitzvah, of course. But we learn from Truma that you in fact can make a shliach to do mi'ilah for you. And that means if you go to a person and you say, I want to point you to gift my friend, 20 bushels of, I don't know, wheat from my storage house. And the shliach goes to the storage house and takes the 20 bushels of wheat and gives them to someone else. If it turns out that that wheat was owned by Hektish, and the shliach took it and basically stole from Hektish, that's what we call mi'ilah, right, by mistake, that or on purpose, but in this case by mistake, then since the shliach was doing exactly what I asked them to do, it's as if I did it. And I'm chayiv, the mishaleach, the one who sent him, is chayiv for mi'ilah and have to pay back and have to get the punishment and the asham and whatever details. So that is an exception to the rule of ein shliach b'dvar aveira. However, as we've learned in there's many mishnayot in mi'ilah talk about this. What if the shliach deviates from what you tell them to do? Right, so you tell the shliach, we had this a lot before, go give two pieces of this to the person, and they give 3, and it turns out to be mi'ilah, right? So the question is, what responsibility then does the shliach take on themselves? So says the Mishnah in mi'ilah, it's not hatam, hashliach she'asa shlichuto. If the shliach does exactly what they were instructed to do, then bal habayit ma'al. Then the one who sent them, the Baal Habayit, is chayiv mi'ilah, because although the Baal Habayit sat at home and was, doing nothing, sitting on their couch, they sent a messenger. The messenger fulfilled what they were told to do, and it's as if the Baal Habayit did it. But if lo asa shlichuto shliach ma'al, if they didn't do what they were instructed exactly to do, then the shliach acted on their own volition. Basically, I told him go take the cucumbers and give them away, and he took my tomatoes, which turned out to belong to Hektish, and that's his responsibility. And no one told him to do that. Now, says Rav Chisda, that Mishnah can't be like Rabbi Akiva. Matnita and Delok Rabbi Akiva, it's not, because the Mishnah continues, and this is why. If you continue in the Mishnah in Mi'ilah, it says Ketza. What do we mean a shliach does their shlichut or does not? What's an example? Amarlo, a man says, or a woman says to a shliach, Tain basar la'orchim, right? You're sitting in your house, you have guests who show up, you say to the waiter, go to the kitchen, take the meat, and give it to my guests. Now, it turns out the meat belongs to Hektish, right? So if the shliach does exactly what you told them to do, then although they gave meat from Hektish to the guests and the guests ate them, the shliach is the one who is not chayiv mi'ilah. It's this one who sent them, because that is the case. That is exactly what you said. Meaning you said give meat from the counter to the guests. And since you gave that instruction and the shliach did exactly what you told him to do, the Baal Habayit, or the sender, is the one who's chayiv mi'ilah. Okay? Chana, we are 6 lines from the bottom. It's not. We just read the Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about a case where you're chayiv mi'ilah. All right, you take something from Hektish either inadvertently. You can also be chayiv mi'ilah on purpose, but let's just say it's inadvertent. It's a little cleaner. But you do it indirectly. So, right, you're at home. You have guests who show up. You tell the waiter, your attendant, take some meat from the fridge and give it to these guests. And the waiter takes meat, but the meat turns out to belong to Hektish, right? And the waiter didn't know that, and you might not have known that. But the waiter did exactly what you told him to do. So the Mishnah said, it's not, we're 6 lines from the bottom. Ketzad, what's the case? Amar lo tein basar lo orchim. You tell the shliach, give meat to my guests. V'natan lahem kaved. Instead of giving them a nice rib steak, he gives them, or whatever, right, corned beef, he gives them liver. Now, it's a little debatable. Is liver considered to be meat or not, right? So I think today people think liver is a little popular, but it was debatable, right? Liver is an organ of an animal. It's not the basar of the animal. So the waiter deviated from what you told him to do. The person deviated. But
you certainly can't eat cheese with it.
We'll keep going. We're going to discuss a lot of this. You certainly cannot. It's definitely the case. But when you said basar, what did you mean? So this is very similar to our Mishnah. Or let's say, continues the Mishnah now, 5 lines from the bottom. Tain kaved. You said to your waiter, give them liver. But natan lahem basar. But he gave them corned beef, right? He gave them meat. So in those cases, says the Mishnah, hashliach ma'al. In those cases, although it's not that different than what you said, it's not exactly what you said, it's sufficiently different. If you went to a restaurant and you ordered meat and they gave you liver, you would be upset, right? So because it's something different, it's not the Gemara's example, it's my example, because it's something different, basically the shliach did their own initiative, And remember, whenever the shliach does something on their own initiative, it's considered mi'ilah for the shliach. If the shliach does exactly what you told him to do, it's mi'ilah for the one who sent them, for the balabait. Now, that's the Mishnah. Says the Gemara now, Rabbi Akiva, if that Mishnah mi'ilah was going according to Rabbi Akiva, ha'amar Rabbi Akiva, kol milta de mimlech ala shliach minehu. Right? In our Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva says that wherever the shliach comes and says, oh, I couldn't find Yerakot in the store, I found pumpkins. Should I buy pumpkins? Even though pumpkins are different than Yerakot, since a person will ask about them, it's considered to be the same type. So here too, if you send someone to the store to buy meat and they had no meat, presumably the person would come back and say, I couldn't find corned beef, but they had liver, right? So therefore, since a person would at least ask about it, it should be the same min, and therefore the shliach essentially did what you told him to do. You said, give my guest meat, and you gave them liver, but the liver is similar enough or part of the min of the meat. So therefore, l'mol bal habayit l'mol shliach. Why don't we then say the bal habayit should be mo'el because the shliach actually did what you wanted him to do, and the shliach should not be ma'al. So it seems that this Mishnah, which says that the Baal Bayit is not Ma'al in this case, is not like Rabbi Akiva. Says Abaya on the bottom line, Afilu Kema Rabbi Akiva, that in fact the Mishnah in Me'ilah could be going according to Rabbi Akiva. Because Milo Mod Rabbi Akiva did Sarech Li'imluche. Rabbi Akiva never said that if you sent a messenger to the store to buy meat, and the messenger said, look, there's no meat available, there's no beef available, but there is liver, that the messenger would just buy it. What the messenger has to do is come back and ask you, right? Rabbi Akiva said in our Mishnah that as long as the messenger comes back and says, can I replace it with something similar? That something similar is the same min, which would be true about kaved. Kaved, if you made a neder, which we'll get to in a second, you won't eat meat, according to Rabbi Akiva, you would not be allowed to eat liver either, because liver is close enough to meat. However, the shliach has to ask you. And in this case, in Me'ilah, the shliach never asked you. They acted on their own initiative. And so since the shliach acted on their own initiative, they basically get responsibility and they're chayav Me'ilah for what happened. So Rabbi Akiva is not saying that because it's a min that they can automatically do it. But Rabbi Akiva is saying that they would have to ask you. So there's a fundamental difference between Me'ilah and neder in that case. So Itmar Shmaita Kamei de Rava. Now they said this whole thing over, this whole daf so far in front of Rava. This is what the Mishnah says, Rabbi Akiva in our Mishnah. This is what the Mishnah says in Me'ilah. This was a biased explanation for how the Mishnah could fit according to Rabbi Akiva. And Amar Lahon, Rava said to them, Shapir Amar Nachmeni. Nachmeni said the right way. This is in fact the way to understand it. Remember Nachmeni, Abaya grew up in the house of Rabba Bar Nachmeni. So he wasn't the son of Nachmeni, but he was supported by Rabba Bar Nachmeni, and therefore they often refer to Abaya as the one who came from the house of Nachmeni. So Shaper Amr Nachmeni. So Nachmeni said correct. Okay, so that's our Mishnah. Now, third line from the top, Man Tana de Palag Aled Rabbi Akiva. Now, who is the Tana who argues to Rabbi Akiva? Remember, Rabbi Akiva in our Mishnah and in Gemara, and the way we're understanding in Me'ilah, says that if you make a neder from a yerek, it includes not just yerakot, which again is the Russia's explanation was things you eat raw or things that grow directly from the vine, maybe according to the Ran, but you're usher even in things that are a fruit that are similar to a yerek, like a pumpkin, which is not similar in many ways, but it certainly is similar in some ways. So according to Rabbi Akiva, you're prohibited because if you sent your shliach to the store to buy Yerakot, and they had no Yerakot, they would come back and say, we didn't find Yerakot, but what about, should we buy pumpkins, right?
Don't you say Adama on pumpkin? If you eat pumpkin?
So we do say Adama pumpkin. So again, so I said in the beginning that Yerek is not the same, Yerek means common usage. So it doesn't, the usage is not vegetable, and that's why I tried not to translate it that way. It's a certain way people describe Yerakot. So we do make Adama on pumpkins and on many things that grow that would be like tomatoes that many would consider to be a pre. Some of it's because the trees don't come back every year. There's different reasons for that. But the question is what you mean in Nedarim is not always the same thing as what you mean in Brachot.
Right. Okay, that's good.
So here you said Yerek. Again, the other explanation, the Russia's explanation, is that Yerek generally means something you eat raw, right? Which would include tomato, of course, right? But would not include a pumpkin. So but it's similar enough that if you sent your messenger to the store and we were talking about Instacart, right? And they didn't have enough to they didn't have enough supply of the whatever you wanted, they would ask you if they can substitute for this thing. So it's a substitute, though it's not quite the same thing. So who's the Tana who argues with Rabbi Akiva? That's Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So Shimon ben Gamliel, the Tanya. Says Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, this is a brighter now, 5 lines from the top. Hanoder min habasar. Person says, I make a neder, I'm not eating meat. I'll be a vegetarian. Asur b'chol minei basar. Okay, you're prohibited from all types of meat. We think this probably means all animals, right? Lamb and goats and beef, etc. The asur b'roshu b'raglayim. You're also asur to eat the head, the brains maybe, and the feet, which are usually things people don't eat, but they're included, right? The ubikaneh, also the kaneh, which usually means the trachea and the lungs, right? Again, parts that when you say you're not eating meat, you're generally thinking of, a steak. But here you're prohibited to eat any part of the animal. Ubikaved and the liver.
Am I in the wrong line? Mine says mutar, plus mutar harosh.
No, you're
I'm on the wrong line. Mutar bashar. Okay.
3 lines. 3 lines.
Yep.
Asur berosh uberaglayim, ubikaneh, ubikaved and the liver, ubilev and the heart. And of course, ofot are prohibited because those are considered to be basar as well. So you can't have chicken. Mutar bebasar dagim v'chagavim. But of course, you can eat fish and you can eat grasshoppers because no one in the right mind would call that meat, right? So this is coming one way on the pescatarian divide. So that's the Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and this is what you were reading, James. This is the opinion that we're now quoting. Says no. Hamoder min habasar. If you prohibit yourself from eating basar, asur b'chomine basar, you can't have any type of animal meat, whether it's a behima or a chaya, as the Ran adds. However, mutar b'rosh, you're allowed to eat the parts of the animal that are not usually eaten, because meat means a piece of steak, or that's not necessarily steak, but a piece of meat. You can eat the brains, you can eat the raglayim, you can eat the feet, ubikaneh, ubikaved, you can eat the liver and the heart, ubalev. And you can eat ofot, you can have birds, because that's not considered basar. Having chicken is no replacement for having a good piece of meat. The ein sarach lomar basar dagim v'chagavim, and you certainly could eat fish and grasshoppers. The chein hayu Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel omer, and similar to this, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel always tried to remind people that kervayim lav basar, that the intestines, kishka, is not meat. Right? It's a part of the animal. You can't eat it with milk. There's no question, right? But it's certainly, when a person says that you want basar, they're not referring to the organs, basically, of an animal, that including the intestines. And furthermore, said of Shimon Gamliel, ochleim lav bar inish. If you eat meat, you're not really a person. You're eating, not meat. If you're eating, the intestines, it's a very low class kind of thing to do. That's one explanation. Okay. Now, so there's some have the girsa. The Bach here has a girsa. Like, what does that mean? You're not a person, right? And others take it out because it just sounds a little bit like we're adding it. But ochleim kibasar le'in zvina lav barinish. What we mean is not that you can't eat it. It's that if you are foolish enough to go to the store and pay $18 a pound for intestines, then you're a fool, right? Meaning they're not equivalent to meat. There's meat and there's meat. If you're paying this for low quality parts of the animal, then you're not a smart person. So that's what Reb Shimon Gamliel. So basically, he was very dogmatic about this, and he felt that when you say basar, you mean meat, and you don't mean the parts of the animal that are not meat, such as the heart or the liver or the intestines, and you don't mean other animals like birds and chicken and fish, of course, that are not considered meat. And so according to Reb Shimon Gamliel, a neder from a yerek would be specifically a yerek and would not include diluim or pumpkins or things that are not literally yerek. Now, ask the Gemara, I don't understand. Why in the world, Ma'ishna, what's the difference between chicken and fish, right? Ma'ishna basar, which has been a question people have been asking for a long time, right? But according to the Tanakama, Ma'ishna basar of the Tanakama de asir. Right? Why does the Tanakama say, a person says, I'm not going to eat basar? That includes chicken. Why? Because the avid shlicha d'nim l'chaleh. Because look, if you send someone to the store to buy food for you, and they say, I want you to buy a piece of, stew, beef cubes, and they don't have it, the shliach would come back and say they didn't have any beef, but they had chicken, right? Even though they won't buy it, because they'll ask about it. The Aved Shlicha de Mimlechaleh, a shliach would come and would ask you. The Basar Dagim Nami, Aved Shlicha, wouldn't the same thing be true about fish? Dilo Mishkach Bisra Mimlechaleh, that if you don't find meat, you're going to ask about it. The Amar, Ilo Mishkach Bisra Aiti Dagim, Velitzri, right? You're talking about a case where if a person won't find meat, they're going to buy fish, or they're going to at least not buy it, but they're going to ask you if they can buy fish, and therefore it should be usher, right? Now, again, just to be clear, this is making assumptions about what the messenger would do, which are highly dependent on the context, right? Because to be honest with you, I think nowadays, at least in my family, right, if someone was going to the store to buy meat and they didn't find meat, they might buy chicken, but they're not going to buy fish, right? It's not a replacement. Especially probably because basar b'chalav, of course, right? Because you're having dairy or meat meals, and they're different in our mind. Clearly, in this context, in the Gemara's time or place, that was not a big. I guess they didn't drink a lot of milk, maybe, I don't know, but there wasn't really a question, and it was, I guess, protein, right? In some ways, so beef is your preferred one. If you don't have beef, you're going to look for other options. Chicken is one, and fish is another. And so in that context, you would ask about both. Again, if it wasn't the case, if a shliach in New York in this 21st century wouldn't ask for that, then obviously it wouldn't be the same halacha. It would depend on the context, right? But that's the Gemara's question. So it says Abaya, Kigon Shekizdam. Abaya says, well, you're right. And so Abaya accepts this argument that if you send your shliach to the store to buy meat and they don't have meat, the shliach will come back and say, I couldn't find meat, but I found chicken, or I found fish if they have fish. And so therefore, if you make yourself asur, according to the Tanna Kama, remember, according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, it's just what you say. So if you prohibit meat, the fact that the shliach will come back and say, oh, I found chicken, it's not the same thing, it's not meat. But according to the Tanna Kama, why is chicken different than fish? Says Abaya, it only makes sense if you're talking about a person who that day probably had bloodletting, had donated blood. They didn't donate, right? They used to, I think the only medicine they had back then, right, was that people were sick, they would take out some of their blood to whatever the goal was, reduce bad humors, right? So the person was hikizdam, and remember, the halacha is that if you give your blood, you should never eat fish. Fish is really bad after giving blood. So clearly this person would never want fish. So when he said, I'm making a neder, I'm not going to eat meat, he clearly wasn't saying I'm not going to eat fish because he wasn't going to eat fish because he's sick. He's coming home from the hospital, and no one eats fish the day you get home from the hospital. Says Gemara, we'll quote that in a second, but that was taken for granted. Says Gemara, but the same thing is true. You don't eat chicken when you come home from the hospital. Lo achal. To Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel said, the misuchar, person who gives blood, the achal bisra, titzafra, parach libe kitzafra. You eat meat in the morning, right? Your heart's going to leave like the morning, meaning, not safra, of tzipor. If you eat meat of a bird, your heart's going to flee like a bird. So eating chicken is very bad luck, or very bad health, I should say, not luck, right, according to them, after you give blood. And further, there's another braita which supports that. Where am I? Like 8 lines on the bottom. Vitanya, aim mikizim, you should not draw blood. Again, this was therapeutic bloodletting. Lo al dagim, remember, we've discussed elsewhere that after you draw blood, you had to eat a meal, or not, they thought you would die, right? Because you were very weak. And so you always had to have some meal. Remember, there was many Gemarot about people who drew blood, and then they had no food to eat afterwards, and they were hallucinating, and they saw all kinds of, visions, because they probably were close to that. But says the Braita, don't rely on your post-bloodletting meal, lo al dagim, never eat fish afterwards, v'lo al ofot, and not birds, v'lo al basar maliach, and don't have salami afterwards. So you see, and Tanya is another braita which supports that. Hikiz dam, that if someone had their blood drawn, lo yochal, you shouldn't eat lo chalav, not milk, lo gvina, not cheese, lo beitzim, lo shachlayim. Usually translate shachlayim as cress. I don't know what cress means, but I guess some kind of green. V'lo ofot, v'lo basar maliach. And so clearly the braita three Brightot now very clearly say that after bloodletting, you shouldn't eat fish. I get it. You shouldn't eat birds. So again, what's the difference in the Tanna Kama that if you say I'm not going to eat meat and you're someone who just came home from the hospital, that you mean just meat of animals and meat of birds, but not meat of fish, right? Says the Gemara, well, the reason is because Shani Ofot, the Efsha Yidei Shlika. You know, the answer is that you can, although you're not supposed to eat birds, you can eat boiled chicken, right? You can boil it. And so since birds are possible to eat boiled, the person who just came home from the hospital may in fact be planning to eat that. And since they then made a neder, I'm not going to eat any meat, they meant to include also birds which are similar to basar, but not to include ofot, not to include, dagim, because no one eats dagim after drawing blood. So very, very local context.
So the idea was that you should eat meat, like real red meat. Like
that was the idea, right? Which makes sense, right? Obviously,
I guess if you're in that mindset, right?
Right.
Yeah, whatever.
Abaye says, well, it's a different case. You know, the person who made this neder that they're not going to eat meat also happened to have an eye infection. The kaivin le eina and dagim are very kashin la'ayin, right? We know that eating fish is very bad for your eyes after you have an infection. So, what are you talking about? Everyone knows the opposite. Everyone knows fish are great for your eyes. If you have an eye infection, you should eat a lot of fish. The Amar Shmuel told us very famous. Remember, Shmuel was a doctor. I'm not sure if this is where he got his medicine from. Shmuel said, look at the aleph bet. It says Nun Samach Ayin, right? We all know the letters go in that order. Nuna meaning fish. Nuna is I don't know what language, but Nuna means fish. Is Sama is a remedy le'inayim for the eyes. So straight out in the alphabet, Nun supports the eyes. So everyone knows, again, I don't know if that's what they taught him in medical school, but everybody knows that fish are good for the eyes. So what do you mean that you have eye infection?
What is the word for blind? And I thought summa is blind.
Summa is one, yeah. Here we're using sama. Sama is like a.
Yeah, but it's pretty close. You could have said, you know, that it's going to blind your
fish. It's true. You're correct. Anyways, it says Sof Uchla. That's referring to the end. When Ron says the end of the illness, that I guess again, it's really unclear exactly when fish is good and when fish is bad. So you have to be very careful. But the Ron here says that you shouldn't eat fish at the end of the illness, but you can eat. I'm sorry, fish are good at the end of your eye illness, but bad in the beginning. Right. So meaning if you're getting better, then fish accelerate improvement. But if you're just getting diagnosed, then fish will make things worse. Either way, again, local context, I don't think any of us are worried about eating fish when we have eye infections today. But the point of the Gemara is, again, this primary machloket, which is when you say a neder for an item, what do you mean? Do you mean just that item or anything that's similar to that item? And according to Rabbi Akiva, the litmus test is the Instacart test, right? You send a shliach to the store and you say, I want you to buy me apples. What will they come? And they can't find apples. So what will they come back and say they found instead, right? So if they have something that they think of as a potential replacement, then that's considered to be within the same family and is prohibited from your neder. If it's something that they wouldn't even mention, then it's not prohibited from the neder. And it seems like we do paskin like Rabbi Akiva. So
it's a little different than Instacart, because Instacart, the guy is not really your agent. He's working for Instacart. If he makes a substitution that you don't want, you basically, I mean, yeah, you can like litigate it with Instacart or something like that and try to get your money back, and they probably will. But you're stuck with it because, like, if I'm not on my phone, I
was using Instacart a little loosely because it's.
No, I understand, but I'm just sort of like I'm a.
But again, it always depends on context, right? Rabbi Akiva's point was, and Instacart's a little different because you also say substitutions permitted, and then you.
Right. But the agent, the agent, he may not want to like go back. It's a lot of schlep. I mean,
it could be. So Rabbi Akiva's, remember, there's a difference in Me'ilah as well, right? So Me'ilah, which is the case where if the shliach does exactly what you tell him to do, they're chayav Me'ilah. If they substitute,
right, then
it's the shliach. But by neder, it really depends on what would people say. And again, it's very contextual. right? What would people think? I guess, I mean, today you'd call, right? But I would never call home and say, I couldn't find eggs, but they have, cucumbers.
Right.
And obviously it's not a replacement. It's not even close. So I think that's really where, like, if you say orange juice and they have grapefruit juice, like that kind of thing.
Right. No, I understand. I'm just thinking of the position of the shaliach.
Right.
He's in sort of a catch-22 situation.
I mean, because you're saying it's tedious for them to return. The Gemara doesn't make that point.
Because also, like, he's a servant. I mean, if he had a lot of money, he wouldn't be working as a shaliach, right?
Right.
So he probably can't afford to be liable for Me'ilah for anything, unless he got a contract stipulation with his boss that if I'm ever liable for Me'ilah, you're going to cover me for it. You know what I mean? I don't know. I mean, I suppose you can make a contract like that.
Well, I mean, the Me'ilah is a special case because to be honest with you, probably the Baal Bayit would pay the Me'ilah fee. It's a question of the extra. But
right.
But I think your case of the servant going to the store is a perfect example, right? They can't buy extra things. They're not like going to buy 4 and come home and
right.
So the question is, what would they come back and say? Was it as a replacement? So think about vegetables, right? It's a very complicated.
It's a difficult position for the person to be in because maybe there's not enough time. The market might close.
Right. So again, these are more we don't take into account that foods might go away, but I got to buy the cucumbers quickly. There might be none left.
Right.
But it's true.
Are we talking about a paid shaliach or unpaid shaliach?
Yeah. It doesn't matter at all. I mean, again, Rabbi Akiva's point here, in terms of Me'ilah, it's a whole different story. But according to Rabbi Akiva, in our Mishnah, the real question is usage, right? You say to a person, I want you to go to the market and buy me 12 ears of corn, right? So if they come back with something else, then presumably that's not included, right? If it could fit within the language, right? You say, and again, our Mishnah's example is Yerakot, which there's a lot of ways to understand what's a vegetable, right? And maybe your word Yerak doesn't even mean vegetable, right? Something that grows from a vine, something that's edible raw, something that comes every year. Like, so what would people generally include within that rubric, right? And so Rabbi Akiva's litmus test is if you send someone to the store for it, using that words, you said, we're having a big dinner tomorrow, go buy some Yerakot, not buy a tomato, right? Buy Yerakot. What would they not what would they buy, right? Anything they would buy is for sure prohibited because that's a Yerek. But what would they come back and say, I couldn't find Yerakot, but I found this thing, should I buy it? So if they do that, then it's considered to be within the family, the larger family of Yerakot, and is prohibited from your neder. And the other example of the Gemara was a great example. What about meat, right? I want you to go to the store and buy meat or dessert, let's say. These are very, I'm not sure, these are very contextual things that would depend on what a person describes meat or dessert or Yerakot. And that's how Rabbi Akiva paskins. We're going to stop here. The Ran actually quotes a little bit interesting from the Rambam about how we come out about fish, because our Gemara seems to imply that fish would be included unless you had an eye infection or had just drawn blood. The Rambam seems to be not so clear about it, but it's an interesting question of whether fish and fowl are included in meat. Shavua Tov, everyone. I'm not here next Shabbat. I think Miriam said she could do Motzei Shabbat, but I'm going to put it on the WhatsApp so people can discuss. But I will be here, God willing, in 2 weeks. So I'm away next weekend. So happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Have a great trip.
Thank you. And I'll see you back soon.
Hanukkah Sameach.